Welcome to this online forum presented by Nonfiction Lab called Holding the Encounter, an Asia-Pacific model for writers and writing together. We're delighted to see you all here, panelists and audience. My name is Francesca Rendell-Short and I'm the host for you today. I'm part of this program called WrICE, which is Writers, Immersion and Cultural Exchange. I'm part of the Australian Research Council research discovery, which is looking at WrICE as a model of encounter and cultural exchange. And I'm also one of the co-founders of WrICE, which started in 2014 with David Carlin. And I'm also a writer and an academic at RMIT University. I'm really delighted to be joined by a stellar panel as well, who I'll introduce shortly. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge the country I'm speaking from today, country belonging to the Wurundjeri and Wurrung people here in Brunswick in Melbourne, part of the Eastern Kulin Nation. I acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sovereignty has not ever been ceded. Today's forum considers the space of encounter in relation to WrICE, as I said, which began in 2014. And it's brought together, astonishingly, more than 70 writers from around the Asia-Pacific region. And we're about to conduct another residency this year, which will bring that number of writers to 80, more than 80 writers from around the region. At the heart of WrICE is this proposition that there's real value in creating opportunities for writers to connect and share ideas deeply with other writers from different cultures, across generations, across forms, across experiences, and that there's real value in a regional perspective. You know, so this region of the kind of the Asia, what we're calling loosely the Asia Pacific region, the kind of the Southeast Asian, North Asian, Asia, Asiatic, Pacific, including Australian region. And we're really delighted, absolutely delighted to have these conversations. They're so rich and valuable and give us such ground to understand who we are and how we can live now and into the future. So the question that we're asking today is, what does it mean to be part of this encounter, to be together? What does it mean to give voice to each other, to create a space of listening, to dream those futures together? And, you know, the very idea of encounter and holding space for that encounter to happen offers a range of generative and provocative considerations like kinship, friendship, collectivity, something that we might call worldling, you know, creating a world that we want to inhabit, but also collegiality, kind of conviviality, and even, you know, difficult conversations that perhaps are hard to have in other forums and other spaces, but if you create a space that's safe and that people feel that they can open up even when they feel vulnerable, it's so wonderful. So to discuss this and more, we've got this wonderful panel for you today. So what I thought I'd do is introduce the panel first in order of how they'll speak, because I've asked each of them to give us their thoughts for four or 5 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion together and then we'll open it up for questions. There's of course the chat that, you know, the audience is more than welcome to write into, and I'll keep a check of that. And then we'll open it up to questions at the end. But just for now, I'd just like to introduce our panel. So we've got David Carlin, who, as I said, is co-founder with me of WrICE. He's an award-winning writer who often works collaboratively. He's a professor at RMIT, here at RMIT, and co-founder of Nonfiction Lab. Then we've got Lily Rose Tope, who's coming to us from the Philippines, and she is former department head of the Department of English and Comparative Literature at the University of Philippines in Diliman. And she's author of Unframing Southeast Asian Nationalism and the Post-Colonial Text in English in Singapore, Malaysia and the Philippines, and co-editor of an anthology of English writing from Southeast Asia. Then we've got Melody Ellis, who's here in Melbourne, and her interdisciplinary writing and research is interested in the politics of value, the body, power, ethics, and the everyday. And she's a member of Nonfiction Lab and one of our chief investigators on the ARC Discovery grant that I mentioned earlier. And then we've got Ramya Shamali Jyotsinghe, I hope I've pronounced that right, who is an award-winning author from Sri Lanka. And her book of poems, There's an Island in the Bone, won the Sri Lankan Prize Literary Joint Award in 2011. And Ramya was longlisted for the Fish Poetry Prize Island in 2011 and was joint runner-up to the UK's Guardian Orange First Words Prize of 2009. Her second collection of poems, Love Poems from a Frangipani Garden, was published by Micah Press in the UK in 2018, and she's also author of several books of non-fiction. And then lastly, we've got Clara Chow, who's coming to us from Singapore, and she is the author of 4 books of fiction, 2 travel logs, and a bilingual poetry collection. She's been a writer in residence at South Korea's Toje Cultural Centre and Victoria's Bogon Centre for Sound Culture, and the US's University of Iowa. She's a former journalist and now runs the micro-publisher Hermit Press based in Singapore. So welcome, everyone. Wonderful to see you all. And so let's hear now from David, and then David, if you can pass to Lily and Melody and Ramya and Clara, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, Francesca, for such a fabulous intro. I'd just like to acknowledge too that I'm coming from Wurundjeri country, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I thought what I might do just quickly to begin with is just to paint a picture really of the model for holding the encounter that we have been exploring through WrICE. So it's somewhere between a writer's residency and what is commonly called a writer's workshop. We call it a collaborative residency model, and how it's worked, and we developed it quite intuitively to begin with, but it's really kind of held its form across various iterations. So there's a curated group of 10 diverse writers who are invited, culturally diverse, geographically dispersed from around the Asia Pacific region, diverse in gender, sexuality, in the forms and genres that they write in, prose, poetry, scripts, hybrids, and also crucially in age and experience as writers. So 10 writers are invited to come together for around 10 days, joining with 2 writer facilitators, so 12 altogether. And as with any writer's residency, it's conceived as a time out of normal life and its everyday pressures. And as with any residency, there's time to write. But the heart of the model really is what takes place for 5 afternoons around a shared table, and we've done a couple of digital WrICEs now, where it's like an imaginary table on a screen. But but during that time in the afternoon, each writer in turn is given an hour, strictly an hour, no more, no less, to have the undivided attention of the group, and they're invited to share some of their work in progress, anything they would like to share, and invite this group of peers and strangers to discuss. So it's a little bit like a conventional Iowa model writers workshop in that each writer and their work takes a turn to be in the spotlight. So lots of creative writing classes and courses use that kind of model. But there are some crucial radical differences from that model too. So firstly, there's no hierarchical separation between the facilitators and the writers. The facilitators are not the experts or the teachers. In fact, the facilitators also have to take their own hour to present some of their work in progress. So in this way, they have to model the vulnerability and uncertainty that's the underpinning of the trust and reciprocity that develops in the group. Secondly, writing cannot be sent in advance for others to read. There's no homework. So also there's no expectation that readers will make kind of editorial comments on the written work as they might do in a typical workshop. And often in other workshop models, people might know that sometimes the writer themselves is not allowed to even speak in a typical workshop. The work is supposed to speak for itself. But so this thing of not sending stuff in advance is intended to help move the conversation away from a narrow focus on critique and craft. Nobody knows in advance what each writer will share. Typically, the writers themselves change their minds as they see what others do before them. The facilitators often take their hour early to model a version of the process. And because nobody knows in advance, people are inclined to listen very carefully. Curiosity is engaged. The writer is encouraged to read aloud. The work's not severed from the writer as if it's an inert object. Instead, it's an expression of them, their desires, their matters of concern. Then the writer frames the conversation as they see fit. What are they curious to learn from this diverse group of listeners in response and in dialogue with the work? Conversation is radically unstructured. It's a genuine encounter in that people are not able to prepare in advance their thoughts and feelings of what they're going to say. The encounter unfolds there and then, and each hour works quite differently. And because each person is sharing something they've created or in the midst of creating, there's an inherent rawness and vulnerability reliant on an atmosphere of gentleness and nourishment. Risk-taking becomes possible, and out of this we have found that strong bonds are formed across the group. And across all of the great differences in the group, the thing that's held in common is that everyone is a writer and is writing. In other words, immersed in a process of unknowing and unfolding, a process of making. And together the group also then makes itself into a group. And finally, after these 5 or 6 days of retreat and conversation, the nascent group emerges into public and together conducts events, readings, workshops, performances, in partnership with festivals, libraries, universities, and other literary venues. So that's just a kind of a quick snapshot picture. And now I'll pass on to Lily.
Okay, thank you, David, and greetings to everyone. Greetings from Manila. It's hot here and rainy, so I hope you have better weather in Australia. And for those who have Filipino roots in the audience, kumusta kayo? That means how are you? And okay, so let me proceed. Let me just start by saying I'm not a creative writer. I always start with that. I am an academic, a researcher, and I'm doing work with RMIT and WrICE, trying to construct theories and articles deriving from the WrICE experience. So much of what I'm going to say would be based on the interviews that were conducted before and after the residency, and also from the interviews with the alumni. So from what I hear, RICE is actually offering a paradigm shift. From my colleagues, from my writer colleagues who have attended several residencies and workshops in various parts of the world, they always say that there's a tendency for these workshops and residencies to be authority oriented. So there's somebody who's an expert, who will share how they write, and everybody's supposed to kind of pick up from that and so on. RISE is different because it is teacherless. It promotes a teacherless process, which encourages, for me, more authenticity and intimacy, because there's no imposed notion of creative productivity. Everything is shared, no matter how trivial, no matter how significant, everything is shared. And the source of that creative productivity would be, immaterial in terms of nationality, gender, etc. The shift, there's a shift in the onus, or the shift, it shifts, sorry, it shifts the onus of experience from learning from an authority to an egalitarian encounter with writers from different backgrounds. And speaking of the encounter, the presence of a stranger, just the sheer presence of of a stranger is already an encounter that incites curiosity, possible commonality, respectful deferring, all in a space that is accommodating. So I hear writers saying, I've never met an Indian writer before. I've never met a Myanmar writer before. And so the space becomes a kind of first contact point for many of these writers. And this is where they form ideas about each other and each other's works. And it also, brings down the point that the region does not really know each other's literature. I doubt if any of you in the audience has read a Filipino work or a Singaporean work, perhaps in your classes or, just leisurely. So I don't think the bookstores in Melbourne would probably carry a lot of Southeast Asian works. So that it promotes a gap, or it creates a gap between and among the writers in the region. So RISE, therefore, it functions in a very significant way in the sense that it brings the writers together mostly for the first time. And without a kind of canon to follow and without a kind of structure that's intimidating, I think the exchange would be friendlier, would be more open, and would be more empathetic, I think. And then, so the space erases distinctions between senior and beginner, between genders and nationality. Instead, it creates narratives that resonate communally and produces not only cultural understanding, but also empathy. So I hear writers saying, oh, we all have these ideas about water, but we have different ideas about water. Or I hear writers saying, oh, oppression is not just in my country, but also in the other countries of these writers. And they share that kind of empathetic experience of being under an authoritarian government. The RISE also has its share of challenges, and like all things, it is a work in progress. And Francesca and David are doing great things in order to make it, well, as close to perfection as possible. But there will always be, some kind of challenge, and there are several. But I'm going to zero in only on one because of lack of time. And I think the most for me, the most striking challenge is the challenge of language. English, because of practical reasons, is a lingua franca among the writers in RISE. But this can tend to exclude those who cannot communicate in English. And in Southeast Asia, and I'm sure also in Australia, there are many writers who do not write in English, but whose works are very salient. So in the interviews, while other writers become instant translators, they help each other out. There are also, at the end of the day, there are also details and nuances that cannot escape instant translation. So something is lost in the translation. And then there's also the challenge of translated works presented during the residency. Yes, something gets lost in translation. And so the challenge now is the possibility of a multilingual residency. And I think that is exciting and that needs to be explored. So maybe at some point, WrICE, English will become only one of the languages. There will be more languages um, um, given by the writers, and translation will become very essential to WrICE. So I envy that. Thank you. So I transferred the mic to Melody.
Thank you so much, Lily. It's also raining here. I'm also joining from unceded Wurundjeri country, and it's a rainy, kind of fairly cold day today, although I'm inside at RMIT in kind of climate controlled environment, and you can probably hear the fan in the background. So I said before in our kind of pre-panel discussion that I wonder if I've kind of gone off in this kind of slightly different tangent. In some ways, my contribution today is going to be grounded less in the kind of nuts and bolts of WrICE and more in a kind of interest or curiosity in the encounter. And I was also interested in taking up the sort of challenge, I suppose, or what a potential challenge of the encounter. So, or not of the encounter, but of holding the encounter. Yeah. So let's see how we go. I'm sort of, in those kind of funny ways that you do these things. I was thinking a lot about this, and then had a bit of a plan for how I might approach it, and then probably overcrafted it. And now I want to sort of undo what I've overcrafted live. So let's see how that goes. But somehow or other, in order not to give a real shock, because one of the ways into this idea of holding the encounter and what might be some of the challenges, and the possibilities, of course, that was one of the provocations, Francesca, that you gave us. What might be some of the challenges and possibilities of this notion of holding the encounter? I was thinking a lot about this family joke that was told often in our household when I was growing up, and it's quite a strange and somewhat violent joke. So I think before I share that kind of joke with you and my kind of thoughts about that, before I start with the challenge, perhaps I'll speak just briefly to one of the things I see as the possibility. So I'm going to begin with where I was going to end my short contribution today, which is with a quote by Susan Sontag, who writes, "The only transformation that interests me is a total transformation, however minute. I want the encounter with a person or a work of art to change everything." And it would seem to me that a total transformation, however minute, is exactly the opportunity that the encounter offers, right? I love that caveat, however minute. And so, again, when I was thinking about what I might say today and what my contribution might be, I was thinking, yes, about this joke that was told in my Greek family. I'm half Greek, Australian, and my father's Greek, and his father was sent out here as a young boy. And I gather that this joke will have been told to my grandfather when he was a child, and so it's old, it's been told in that village, and to him, I think, or this could be the mythology that I've built around it. But in any case, it's the joke that he used to tell, and then my father used to tell it to me, and it goes like this. Once upon a time, a man is visited by an angel who offers him a wish. "I don't mean to be ungrateful," says the man, "but what's the catch?" The angel is confused. "There is no catch," it replies. "You can have one wish, anything you like," but the man doesn't believe him. "Come on, there must be a catch," he insists. And it goes on like this for a while, the man insisting that there must be a catch and the angel insisting that there isn't, until finally the angel says, "Okay, look, it isn't a catch. You can have anything you like, but whatever you ask for, your neighbor will receive double." And the man thinks about it for a while, and then he points to his left eye and he says, "See this eye? Poke it out." So you can see it's not funny, right? And yet my grandfather would burst out laughing at this, you know, every time he told it, as if it was some, said something very profound about human nature, and perhaps to some extent it does. And perhaps that's what I want to use as a provocation, which is something like, well, let's say before I do that, so I had this idea of, will I tell the joke? It's a terrible joke to tell, and it's not a joke. It's a, you know, it's actually not a joke. But that's the kind of mythology of it, is that it's a joke, right? In our household, in our family. And then I looked up the definition of encounter, which oddly I haven't done before. And I find this, right? So encounter, verb, the first definition of verb, unexpectedly be faced with or experience, in brackets, something hostile or difficult. 2, meet, in brackets, someone unexpectedly. And then noun, an unexpected or casual meeting with someone or something. And so I suppose that for the purpose of today, I want to engage this joke, in inverted commas, as a reminder of one of the challenges of the space of encounter with human, or indeed other than human other. Okay, so, and I'm aware it's a kind of absurd example, and perhaps it runs the risk of being too simplistic or heavy-handed, but it seems to me that extremes can be quite useful precisely because, or when they are so exaggerated, right? Because we can then kind of distance ourselves from the intensity of it, maybe. So we might say that the angel joke, beyond being about desire and indeed paranoia about the other, is about what we're taught by the culture at large about relationships. So in my case, my grandfather's village culture, I don't mean to use the word village here in a pejorative sense, but just that village culture then transposed, passed through him to his children, and then to me by my father, and then presumably by me to my daughter, and so on and so forth. Right? So what's at stake in the joke is the politics of having and not having, but also of believing in good fortune and of not believing in it, right? So to be fortunate in the world of the joke is to win, which is basically to not lose, such that the loss of one eye is a wish come true when it means the loss of both eyes for the other, right? It's heavy. But I want to say that this is perhaps one version of what we're all taught about the world and about the other, about winning and losing, even as my use of the word all is again an absurd exaggeration, and it's totalizing, right? So I think it takes a good deal of imagination, and this is why, bear with me with all of this kind of intensity, this is why I've evoked this so-called joke today. I think it takes a good deal of imagination to refuse the prescribed narratives of winning and losing, of threat, hostility, failure and loss, to hold a different kind of space open for ourselves and for those encounters we have with the so-called angels and neighbours in our lives. I'm convinced that the holding of such a space is a continual relearning or unlearning of how to be open to the risk that the presence of the other brings with it, to have the courage or the wit or the gall or the curiosity to be in the company of the other without putting one's preemptive defences up and instructing the angel to poke out your eye. So that's what I'm thinking about somehow in relation to this encounter, and I'll pass to Ramya.
Thank you, Melody. That was fascinating. And thank you, Francesca, for inviting me to this. Everyone's comments got me thinking. And I think the encounter for me was very, very significant, because living in South Asia, you would think that Asians are more familiar with, if not the writing, because the books may not be accessible, like Lily said, but at least with the encounter of the individual. But I found when we met in the group, and there was this wonderful diversity of people from Myanmar, Singapore, Australia, that I had not had any clue about the writing lives of people from the Asian region, apart from a very narrow South Asian kind of encounter with the South Asian writers. So for me, that was an incredible starting point, this initial encounter. And I got to find out things, and I'll come to that later in kind of how it inflected my own writing. It gave me this encounter with individuals from regions that were so close to me, but were yet so far away, but at another level, who I was also familiar with, because we do have in Sri Lanka a very sort of, well, it used to be much more multi-ethnic than it is now, but we grew up in a very multi-ethnic society. I grew up in a multi-ethnic society where my neighborhood had a lot of settlers from the Southeast Asian and the Far Eastern region, East Asian regions. So like they are my closest neighbors. What we call here are people who recognize themselves as the Malay people. And I had grown up and we were extremely close. I consider them closer than my immediate cousins or my relatives, because we grew up, my parents have been known each other for over 50, 60 years. And I knew their words. You know, I'm familiar with Bante, Kake, all the Malay words. And then when I came to this encounter, first of all, as David said, it was radical. It was unusual in terms of what it expected from us. It was very unusual. It had the basic format, yes, but it kind of broke completely, not just in a small way, but for me in a very radical way, broke the mold in the way it placed expectations on us as the writers. And by doing that, it sort of, I think, freed us to listen to people, to genuinely hear people, because what I have noticed in sort of the more conventional workshop settings, that you are too busy thinking of what you want to say. Not when, I mean, that's a thing that we all do, as humans always do this, but even in the longer term, like even if you're listening on a Monday for your presentation, you're planning your presentation on a Wednesday, and kind of in a response, kind of how to better it, there's like this unsaid hierarchy forms, even if there is no hierarchy. And that none of that happened here, you know, because there was this opportunity. The space holding became a place for genuine sharing without an expectation to respond to it, or without an expectation to kind of answer to someone else. And that I found was the most beautiful thing about WrICE. So then then it comes back to my first encounter, this holding the space, and then what it did to me. And what it did to me was fascinating, because another thing that WrICE does not do, which I really appreciated, was that it did not set a formal theme for the workshop. It did not say this year's theme will be about this. It did not really say that. I don't think it did. You didn't, right? If it did, you didn't drum it into us. But what did happen was, in the course of holding this encounter, the space, within me, for everyone, I think, there were various themes that seemed to come out of our commonality. For each person, it might have been different, and there were some very obvious ones which we discussed. For me, it became language and words. And everyone had their kind of stories and their narratives and their own personal encounters from their writing, from their cultures, and from their histories, which they brought to this encounter, to this space. And I found that was one of the most creative encounters I've had because of that, because I never expected that an encounter could actually trigger off a creative piece of writing. But that's exactly what happened to me. Based on this encounter, I was able to craft a new poem, and it must have been good, because, or interesting at least, because it got published. It found a publisher. It got published in the Commonwealth online journal called ADA. So for me, that was there was no expectation for a piece of writing to come out of it, but it naturally emerged. So I think you're doing something right, you know, because if without telling people to write, they end up writing without having to do that. And the workshop naturally kind of produces that, and produces something based on something the writer had not previously kind of made it kind of thematic focus. I think something very interesting is happening, and I don't know to break it down, but I think it's good, and I would really support it. Thank you. So over to Clara.
Thank you, Ramya, and I'm so happy to see all of you, and also Ramya today. I thought I'll just start by talking about a scarf. Ramya will know what I'm talking about. So during WrICE, I offered to knit everyone a scarf if they wanted, and Ramya was like, okay, you know, like, could you make me one? So I said, okay, I'll make you one that is made of cotton and full of holes so that you can wear it in Sri Lanka where the weather is not cold. So I made it, and then I tried to send it to Ramya, but then when I got to the post office, they said that unfortunately Singapore is not running a postal service to Sri Lanka for the time being. So I told Ramya, I said, I can't send it to you, but I will hold on to it, and I will give it to you when I finally get to Sri Lanka again. So I mean, I think holding the encounter, I am actually really physically, literally holding the encounter because I'm holding the scarf. Um, and yeah, like I feel like during the residency, there were so many conversations that were so personal, and so dear to me. And I hold on to them because I love them so much, right? And I really appreciated the way that everyone just kind of listened, really listened with a lot of care and generosity. And it's been very interesting for me this morning to actually listen to what David is saying about how so much thought went into kind of crafting the structure for WrICE. But when we were actually in it didn't feel like that, or it didn't feel like there was some kind of deliberate like way that this was being run. We just felt like, okay, this is happening, and you know, it felt very organic. So that's real mastery, I think, when you can kind of make things go and sort of make it invisible. Yeah. So I think one other thing that I got from WrICE was also how it was possible to be intimate, even though we were never in the same room. So we were sort of like pandemic edition WrICE, right? And we did it all over Zoom. But then at some point we found time to write a poem together collectively, and we memorized it, and then we burnt it, and that was our little ritual. And I felt like that was kind of like personal consecration was possible in a long distance remote setting. And even though we might forget the lines that we were tasked to remember, I will never forget the kind of enthusiasm that everyone embraced, this spark that I threw out, and then, you know, it just carried on. And I'm still on the theme of fire, because one of the things that Francesca said during the residency was about the campfire. I mean, she mooted this idea of just being there for one another and sitting and witnessing. And I thought, wow, that's great. Like, I really like this idea, right? And then ever since then, whenever I meet new people, I would always think, what does this encounter give rise to? Like, is it possible to kind of go to this encounter and be there for a community that I care about? Am I able to bear witness to how people are changing? And that in itself has kind of changed the way that I meet strangers, right? Yeah, so more than like being a writer, I think being a person, I think I kind of changed after WrICE. And then also when I listened to other writers share freely about their work, I came away with a sense that a lot of what they do is charged with the communal, with the particular, with the awareness of the marginalized, and with the political. And I think the tendency during the pandemic for me was to kind of go inwards. So the work was very much about like, oh, let's see what new demons I can uncover and how I can confront them, right? But then after WrICE, I realized that actually this outward movement is also very important. Like it's very worth reaching out and trying to connect with other people. So I heard stories about like sort of dealing with history, dealing with wartime exploitation, or sort of dealing with like the high murder rate in a community. And I felt like this is up to me to find like my place in my community and find what I need to say and the identities I can lay claim to. So in that sense, I felt like that also informed how I do things now. And then would the encounter have been different if we had all been in the same room? Definitely, because we would have maybe like bonded over like, let's go to the pub or let's go shopping. But then I found that just being forced to sort of be alone in our rooms, but together, made us all engage purely on the level of ideas. So I felt like I was really like, let's really like, talk about writing, let's talk about process, and the sort of things that keep you up at night. And if we had been in the same room, I think, we could like reassure each other, we could touch, we could, do other things. And that would not have forced us to articulate in words the things that we need to say. Yeah. So we were asking questions because we all had to imagine realities that we cannot see because we can't even go there in this particular time. So I think we really tried very, very much harder because of the pandemic. And then in the last session, we were asked what we had gleaned from our time together and how we will take it forward in our practice. And so I had this whole list of projects that had come out of, oh, what if we did this? What if we did it? And these were all like from conversations that we had in our breakout rooms. So it still feels good to know that wherever we are, we will continue to make art within our own context, and we will be grappling with our own advantages and our own limitations. I don't feel so alone because I know all the other WrICE residents are doing that. And I've learned that writing comes out of the simple things, just sort of domestic gestures or genuine offers. It spins like a thread from the most basic and caring of questions like, what time is it where you are? Oh, how is the weather today? Yeah. And then also, can I make you a scarf? Right? So I think writing is an encounter. You need to hold space for it. And sometimes it does take a long time, but it's like a door, right? So if you hold it, eventually someone will come and then you answer it. And that is all I have to say. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I can't tell you how wonderful this forum is because it creates a space of encounter for all of us, the 6 of us, to come together to talk about this experience from different points of view. It's really marvelous. What a great thing. So thank you, Nonfiction Lab, for inviting us to do this, and thank you everyone for all that incredible kind of thoughtful, deep, discursive, intersecting thinking that you've just done for us. And I'm so pleased this is being recorded so that we can go back and digest some of it. But just to pick up a couple of points and then we'll open it up to discussion. And I know Julianne has put in something in the chat around improvisation, but there were just a couple of things that occurred to me. One is, I thank you, Melody, for going to the dictionary. I live for the dictionary, like I go to the dictionary for everything, but I haven't been to the dictionary for encounter. I can't believe it. And what a find there, because you look at it and you break it down. So the English word, the contra, which is the encounter bit, is against. So this idea of coming together, but there's something that we're pushing or encountering or kind of sensing experience that's against as well as towards. So there, those kind of beautiful preposition again, and just thinking that hostility that you mentioned as well, Melodies, so that embedded in that in the definition, in the verb, is to experience something hostile or difficult in the encounter, because it's a pressing towards, isn't it? You know, and it's pressing towards strangeness or stranger or otherness. So I found that interesting. And the other thing I found really intriguing, Clara, with your beautiful gift to Ramya, I just love this kind of metaphoric material matter, thing of matter that you've made, this beautiful scarf in cotton with holes. And so I think then of you holding this, you know, because you can't send it, and so that sense of refusal embedded in the encounter, and then telling us about that now. I don't know whether Ramya, you knew about this, but that's just such a beautiful gift. So when you were saying it about how it holds space, but then I thought also of it having holes. So it kind of holds space, HOLES space. And I love that. Like the very thing itself is kind of holding the holiness of space and the play of language there. Yeah, that was just fantastic. But you know, there's so much else to talk about. So I just thought, just quickly back to the panel, any thoughts, and then we might talk perhaps about this question of improvisation. And please, our audience, David, is this where we'd like them to turn on their cameras? Perhaps if you'd like to entertain us with your vista, and then we can kind of ask the question or put it in the chat. But first, back to the panel, just on, yes, that commentary on the definition itself and the scarf, or anything else you want to pick up on. Anyone from the panel?
Oh, Francesca, I totally agree with you, like with this whole thing about holes and holds. And I just think that in every encounter, it's about osmosis in a way. Like you do need it to be a bit porous so that the other person can change you and you can kind of change the other person. And that's really what exchange of ideas is. Yeah.
Yeah, it lets it breathe, you know, breathe together. Yes. Mm.
Yeah, and one of the things, just to pick up, I think, on something that Ramya said, and people mentioned in some of the interviews we've done about the encounter of writing lives, writers' lives. So it's not so much necessarily about the work divorced and, you know, I've learned how to write a poem better or something, but more that people have a sense of becoming friends with strangers, and of connecting with how other people live their writing lives. So it's kind of an interesting shift from it being about kind of the writing as product to writing as process and as you know, a way to live. Yeah. I'm not sure, just by the way, I was given some task about making people able to be visible if they want to, but I'm not sure I know exactly how to do that. So if you want to be able to speak and you're not allowed to currently, then just put it in the chat and I will help to do that for you.
I just wonder if I might jump in there as well, David, just about this idea of how to live. And I'm just, I guess, wondering if that relates to scholarship too, in a way. And probably this is on my mind because I'm, you know, was teaching the current honours cohort here in the school this morning, and I'm going to go back to them after this. So this is kind of like a pause in the middle of my encounter with them, if you like. But it would seem to me that there's something to say too about the way that we think sometimes that scholarship gets represented as if it's separate to life, separate to lived life, and this kind of grand thing. And in fact, perhaps part of what we're talking about here is that in the encountering of one another and being changed by one another, that also happens in relationship to texts and to you know, to our communities of practice, and that scholarship is a way of living somehow. That's my provocation, my further provocation.
Yeah. And anybody on the panel like to? Oh, Lily, you want to say something? Sorry, you go.
Yes. I just want to say that WrICE is just a first encounter, and the encounters actually continue outside of WrICE. So I just want to inform the audience that the friendships, the connections that were formed inside WrICE are continued outside. So writers will have their own projects outside of after WrICE, and they visit each other. They have collaborations. They have joint projects together. And for me, for want of a better term, I would probably label that as, mission accomplished, or a successful encounter. So it's not just an encounter that leaves us on the acquaintance level, but an encounter that pushes towards a more lasting kind of connection. And that's a successful, for me, that's a successful encounter because it becomes productive, it becomes continuing, and it also becomes perhaps a starting point of something grander or greater than a writer's residency, maybe a program, I don't know, so a scholarship, whatever. So I think everything begins with that encounter, and the encounter continues to give birth to further encounters. And what is interesting also is that the encounter is passed on to other writers, because I know that WrICE alumni would encourage their friends and their fellow writers to join WrICE who do not know anything about WrICE. And the what do you call that? The snowball effect, I guess, of WrICE is amazing. It's just amazing. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Lily.
I'm interested in just responding maybe to Julian's question about improvisation, but beforehand, I just wondered if either Ramya or Clara wanted to say anything about improvisation. If you can see that comment of Julian's in the chat, where she says, "Is the approach to workshopping in WrICE a form of improvisation?" Do you think?
I think in terms of workshopping, there wasn't really like formal pieces of work that we were kind of like workshopping or commenting on, but then improvisation existed when someone presented a piece of work and then we were all like, oh, okay. And then there were like suggestions to translate the poetry, and then that actually grew into a book length work where everyone translated the same thing in different languages. And then one of the writers, Eugene Bacon, she actually got a book deal, and then that book is coming out. So I think not so much improvisation on one piece of work itself, but improvisation on like just the project and just kind of making it bigger. And I think someone mentioned the word snowball, and I think that's probably the right word.
For me personally, I find improvisation extremely stressful because I think that you're put on a stage and you don't know what's coming. And writing is a process where you don't know what's coming, but being on a stage to improvise, I find that very stressful, and I am really, really, really grateful that WrICE did not force type of improvisation on us. So personally, no, I don't think there was any kind of compelling me to improvise in any sense, because if you didn't want to comment on anything, you didn't need to. You know, you could just absorb what was being said and hold the space for someone without any comment. But as Clara said, out of these things came. But that was not something that we were kind of compelled to do. They just naturally, organically kind of flowed out of the process.
Yeah, and I think what I was going to say was that in one sense, I can see that you could say that the conversation, it wasn't that people tend to improvise about the work, as Clara said, but the conversation in itself is an improvised thing that happens, and the thing that I find interesting about that is that idea of, you know, in jazz or whatever, with improvisation, that's it's based on a structure, and there's something, and you know, it makes you also think. Sometimes we talk about protocols, you know, that there is something very formal. You know, we talk about it all being sort of about uncertainty and etc. But there is a kind of a strong sort of formal shape to the gathering, which enables the uncertainty and the unfolding to happen within that. You know, it's not just like, oh God, what's going on here? Like, I think everybody feels like it's a very structured form. So that's the really fascinating thing I find, is that interplay between structure and openness. You know, how that becomes something that's enabling rather than constraining or restricting.
We've just got one more minute. I just wondered, Joe, you've come on camera and I can see that you had a comment in the in the chat around paradox, you know, which I think is a great word to think about in relation to the porousness, the holding, but the kind of the openness and the sort of the movement back and forth.
Yeah, I guess responding to Clara particularly, and that whole idea of the porousness. And for me, I'm an improviser by trade, a dancer, writer and improviser. So for me, it is a process of improvisation, and I work with the page as a stage. I see it as a stage. Mm-hmm. So it is that kind of practice. And I wonder whether what you're talking about is what you were just saying then, David. It's kind of like a score for holding uncertainty, which makes these kind of the immediacy and intimacy of translation possible or open. But yeah, this continuous paradox. And one of you said as well something about academic life and living and this kind of work and poetics. It's just so energizing to be here this morning, because I find that, you know, difficult always in that encounter. And Lily, thank you for your kind of contribution, because it just really helps to see how these modes of practice can work together to expand the conversation. So really grateful. Thank you, everyone.
Oh, thank you, Joe, for those comments. That's food for thought. And I love the transposition, if you like, from the literary writing space into the dancing space. And that's so helpful because it develops our kind of vocabulary, if you like, or kind of sense of understanding what it is that we're doing, but in another kind of space or in another dimension. So thank you so much. I'm really sorry to say that we've come to the end of our time. I think this conversation was just so fantastic, and it feels like the beginning of an ongoing conversation. I want to thank in particular our WrICE residents who have come today. So Clara and Ramya, thank you so much for your contribution. It's just so marvellous having you tune in and give us really that kind of experiential kind of touchstone of what it's like to be, and I want to continue those conversations. Thank you for your contribution. And of course to Lily from the Philippines, thank you so much, and Melody and David, my colleagues here. Wonderful, rich conversation. A recording of this is being made so that we can enjoy that. And thank you, Julienne. I see you there as one of the co-directors of Nonfiction Lab for this opportunity. It's really, really quite wonderful to have it. And we'll do more. We'll do more of this. So thank you, and farewell for now.